obviously the upside being it may work. The downside being the chemo is very strong and maybe what kills me instead of the AML.
Welcome to UAB Green and Told. I'm Greg Barry. This conversation begins with a life or death choice, then unfolds into a story about strength and stubborn hope. Avery Heffernan was born in Bellevue, Washington, before his family crossed the country for his father's work building rockets in North Alabama. He grew up in Madison, shaped as much by hospitals as hometowns, learning early what it means to adapt when life changes course. Before he ever studied how the human body works, Avery was learning what it takes to survive when the odds aren't theoretical.
The story is my father was building airplanes for Boeing, and he got the opportunity to move across the country to work for United Launch Alliance in Decatur, Alabama. So instead of building airplanes, he would build rockets. And so, as one does, he moved the family across the country. This was in 1999, so I think I would have been 5 years old. And so I grew up in Madison, Alabama, came to Birmingham in 2016 to go to UAB, and I've been here ever since.
Now, you have battled adversity almost from day one. Within a year, you
Yeah.
were diagnosed with a specific kind of leukemia. What was the prognosis at that point in your life? Obviously,
Yeah.
you're not going to remember that, but I'm
No,
sure the stories have been relayed.
no, I appreciate the question. My understanding is that, diagnosed the day after my first birthday. And my parents told me this story where they could see the families around us with the same thing that I had, AML leukemia, and they were undergoing the standard course of treatment. And they were unfortunately not making it. So the was you could do the standard thing of care, or you could choose this more aggressive version that isn't, the standard of care. But obviously, the upside being it may work. The downside being the chemo is very strong and maybe what kills me instead of the AML. And my parents, bravely enough, chose to do that one. They chose the more aggressive version, and now it's treatable.
By the time you moved to Alabama when you were 5 or 6 years old, was that all behind you? Were you given a clean bill of health at that point?
Yes, sir, absolutely. So the way it kind of works is obviously there are late effects, and I still I go to here at UAB, I go to UAB Pediatrics, taking on life after cancer clinic. So I still, do my due diligence and go to the clinic and make sure I'm going to all these specialty, doctors. But at the time, I was in remission for, 5 years or whatnot, 4 years. But I always remember and never really understood for a while. I just thought that I went to a bunch of physicians' offices all the time. I was like, okay, I see a cardiologist, I see an endocrinologist, I see an oncologist. I go to so that was always something that my parents, did an excellent job of. I saw everyone that I was supposed to. If there was a referral that I was supposed to go to, they did that. While I was in remission, it's not like it is today where I've been in remission for 29 years and they're not worried about, the cancer coming back. They're more worried about, long-term effects down the road. So when I was 5 or 6, they were more, okay, is he going to grow appropriately? Is his growth going to be stunted? Is he going to have issues developing, when it comes to cognitive, thinking and evaluation? Is he going to be able to excel in school, because the effects of the chemotherapy on the brain, and, maybe creates like, learning issues and things like that. So it was more of the being diligent about the long-term follow-up. But obviously, as a young child, I think it's easy to take for granted health and, the fact that, your parents are doing that and, taking you to all those different people. And I can really appreciate it now because it's not easy just getting referrals to, places and then following up with that and understanding what they're telling you, and then being able to relay that to the next person and kind of having everyone work as a care team. That's challenging. And so that's kind of what I appreciate a lot about that and kind of where that stood when we moved to, right outside of Huntsville.
Do you remember the point in your childhood that you realized, oh man, this was serious? Because when you're 5, 6, 7 years old, yeah, you might understand things, what you went through, but you probably didn't have a grasp of the enormity.
I think it was I'm trying to think, maybe 2008 or 2009 when I also got involved with kind of the fundraising that my mother was doing for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. She would sign up for these races. She would do like a triathlon or a half marathon or whatnot and go, door to door, call people, work her network and say, hey, I'm going to do this to raise awareness, for this cause. Will you sponsor me? And donate to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. She went to her group, which was called Team in Training at the time, basically because it was a team to raise money for this cause, and no one was an athlete. Maybe someone was an athlete, but the point was is that these are just regular people, and they all showed up in a parking lot at 7 in the morning, and they were going to start with a 3 mile, run walk and work their way up to whatever they were doing, whether it was a half marathon or a marathon. So I got involved with that because I was a track and field athlete in middle school, and so I decided, why not? I'm young, and I'll join my mom with this, and kind of be a what ended up like an inspiration to all these mothers and grandfathers and lawyers and dentists and just regular people. It turned out to be this inspiration to them, but I didn't really realize how serious it was until I was doing that in training. And I did run 2 half marathons, but hearing the stories of these kids that aren't making it and seeing the pictures and the families and how it's devastating them, and then seeing how very seriously they took these, they needed these dollars to go towards the research and to help, families be able to pay for the long-term living expenses, when you're at this hospital in this other city. So I think that's when it really dawned on me that, people are willing to run 26 miles and fundraise, thousands of dollars for people that will impact people that they won't even ever know. I think that's when I was like, wow, people are dying from this, and I did not die from this. I think that's when I realized how meaningful it was that my parents made the decisions that they made and how lucky I was to have the outcome that I had.
Would you consider yourself a normal child?
Yeah, yeah. I went to Liberty Middle School and Bob Jones High School, and I sort of just felt like any other person because you couldn't tell unless I told you, and it's not something that there's a select few people who know really everything that went on. But when we're in the family picture, you couldn't tell. You wouldn't be able to tell, which one of the siblings, we're just normal people.
And then you were met with more adversity as you were just entering your teenage years and growing into yourself. You had a seizure, first seizure that you had. Do you remember that? And
Yes, sir.
and how scared were you?
Well, this is kind of how it happened. I was on a vacation with my grandmother and my late grandfather, and it was just me, my brother, and my grandparents. And my nana is a travel agent, so she has always taken us on, like, oh, we're gonna get the family together and go on a cruise. And so I was on a cruise and we had stopped in Mexico. Apparently, my brother found me having a seizure in the shower one morning when we were going to go. I don't know what the site excursion was we were going to do. But my brother found me that way. And I remember waking up in the hospital in Mexico. And they have different equipment. They have different resources. In Mexico, They thought that I had central nervous system leukemia or something to that effect. So they thought I had relapsed. And so my entire family was freaking out. So they airlift me out of Mexico to Vanderbilt University Hospital. It turns out that it's not central nervous system leukemia. It's they end up, putting me on an anticonvulsant and start treating me, for epilepsy. And then that kind of started the long-term, monitoring and medication management of, finding a group of medications that would control the seizures. But that's how that happened. I remember it very clearly. I'm sure my brother remembers it very clearly, because he's the one who found me. That's uh, that's how that vacation ended.
That was the first one. How many subsequent ones did you have before things really got under control?
I believe I went some time without having the next one, and maybe they were like, "Oh, it was a fluke." He stayed out, playing basketball, and the cruise was so fun because we could do whatever we could. It's like a moving city, we could go eat pizza whenever we wanted, and so I was like 13 or something, so I was having fun. Did I stay out late until 11 p.m. midnight? Sure. I think the next one happened. I think I was in the classroom. And then that's after the second one is when they can formally diagnose you with epilepsy. And then so they put me on medication, and then years go on where I'm trying a medication and then having a breakthrough seizure, or I'm on a couple of medications and having a breakthrough seizure. They are having a hard time identifying where the seizure is starting from in the brain. They think it might be on one side of the brain, they think that it might be on the other. They end up sending me over to UAB at the seizure monitoring unit several times to try and isolate where in the brain, these seizures are starting. So, they would keep, my father and I would be in the seizure monitoring unit, sometimes a week at a time. The ironic part is when you needed me to have a seizure, it wouldn't happen the first day. It might take 5 days, and so we would be, stuck in the hospital, room, and then, I would have a seizure, and then they would try and, use the technology that they have to, image the brain and all this stuff. And that went on for years because they couldn't find it in just one spot. And my parents were trying to pursue the best course of treatment that the experts would recommend. And UAB is right up there with the best of the best in the country when it comes to epilepsy. Eventually it gets to the point where, it's 2015 now, we've been doing this for several years. I'm having sometimes 2, 3 seizures a day. I'm trying to graduate high school. I'm on a lot of medication. So it gets to that point where they start talking about, well, maybe we could put like some kind of, stimulator, in your brain to do this, kind of like someone may have a pacemaker. Maybe we could do some kind of surgery to remove the part of the brain where the seizures are starting from. And that's when they start to talk about that. And it's 2015. And my dad, I think during one of the seizure monitoring, sessions at the end after they've gotten all their information, he goes, well, he asked one of the fellows, he said, if you could go anywhere and it was your child, where would you go, to have this operation?
Mhm.
And they were like, oh, Cleveland Clinic, hands down. So we go to Cleveland Clinic to get a second opinion. And Cleveland Clinic wants to do some of the testing over again, obviously due diligence. But while they're, asking me these questions, they say, "What hand do you write with? Like, are you right or left-handed?" And I was born left-handed. My family noticed that I wanted to gravitate towards the left hand, but they forced me to use my right hand. Up until that point, I'm like, "Oh, I'm right-handed." And I don't know what came upon me to mention that to them, but I was like, well, I use my right hand, but I wanted to be left-handed, and my parents forced me to be right-handed. And apparently, that completely changed the where they wanted to operate and how they wanted to do it because the brain being contralateral, if I really am left-handed, it impacted, which part of the brain does the language. And so they decide to operate on the right occipital lobe instead of a different place in the brain because my right occipital lobe already was smaller than my left occipital lobe. And Cleveland Clinic came to the opinion that it had this, softening and shrinkage because it looks like I had a stroke when I was born, when my mother was giving birth to me. And they were like, well, that side of the brain is already, damaged and injured. And some of the seizures, it looks like, are starting there. It makes sense to take that part out anyways. So they decide to operate on the right occipital lobe and some of them, the hippocampus and, these other areas of the brain. They told me that a year from then, if it was successful, it would be about a 50-50 chance that I wouldn't have any seizures. I would still probably have to take a small amount of medication, but not the plethora of medication I was on. And they said that was the outcome a year from now. However, I would lose some peripheral vision on the left side of each eye. And that sounded like a pretty good trade to me.
Yeah.
Being 20 years old now, I've gone through my whole, high school and teenage years. I was brave enough to say yes, and I don't know if I might chicken out now that I'm 30. I think about, I'm like, wow, this could have went terribly wrong. But I say yes, and I have not had a seizure since. Now that I don't have to worry about that, it gave me my life back, having that operation and then being able to think about where I'm going to go to college. That was because before I was like, I'll just stay at home and live at home with my parents, and I will attend community college online. And then all of a sudden in 2015, I'm attending transfer day at UAB, and talking about transferring to UAB. I could walk everywhere. I don't need to drive, UAB's the city, So that completely changed everything for me, where I have independence and autonomy, and I can wake up and I didn't know this when I came to UAB, when I came to Birmingham at the time, but that Publix grocery store just got built, in 2015.
Hmm.
Birmingham is kind of on its ascent, at the same time that I'm getting this new outlook and opportunity to pursue something other than, living with my parents and, going to college online. So that, I mean, that changed everything. I mean, you think that's bam, bam, that's within the span of 24 months,
Yeah.
my outlook is completely different.
There's a lot of different urban institutions, and I bring up that because you like the walkability
Yeah.
of UAB. Why, however, did you choose UAB? What sold you on Birmingham?
It's a big city within the state. It's not too far away, but it felt like a change of pace. I knew that I could get great health care, because all my physicians and everything are already here. So there's somewhat of a familiarity where, I'm like, okay, I kind of know what that's like. But, when I looked at all the different academic opportunities and when I visited the campus, that's when I fell in love with it. I'm like, the campus green, it being such a young institution, and then again, being familiar with it, and then looking at the choices that they had academically, it felt like the right choice. I had looked at other schools. UAH is right in my
Hmm.
backyard. It's very close to where my parents are. Birmingham and UAB, it's very vibrant. There are a lot of people living, in close proximity downtown. You can wake up and go to the Pepper Place Farmers Market on a Saturday and go see a baseball game on a Sunday. There are a number of places where you can go to, see your friends, Morris Avenue in that historic district area. Birmingham has a lot of urban charm where a lot of, like you said, there are a lot of other urban institutions. It doesn't feel the same. Birmingham still has some of the, the old brick buildings, the old brick infrastructure, along with, some of the, more modern, they're building, 5x1 apartments. It seems like every other month, so there's just this surge of people living downtown. And, I feel like, yeah, I kind of wanted to be a part of that.
Kinesiology, you majored in. What was it behind choosing that major? Was that just partially because of the background that you had up to that point?
Yeah, I think that's primarily what motivated it. My brother is a doctor in pharmacy, and my sister is she's a nurse and she's in school for her doctor of nursing practice. And my parents always said, you need to go into healthcare because that is always going to be a stable job. And so, I kind of pursued that angle, going, okay. I will declare as pre-physical therapy, and I will do the thing that makes the most sense. I would do it differently if I could do it now. But that's what I chose, and it was the most streamlined path to being a pre-professional student. And you know what? I really enjoyed the coursework. Like I'm not gonna lie, it was it's a fun thing to study. And I do enjoy that. And everyone in that field, all of my professors were fantastic. That was some of the most fun I've ever had learning.
You didn't go to PT school ultimately.
You know, um, PT school, I got accepted. It didn't work out. Okay, so that ended up being an aspiration, something I tried. I learned a lot from it, and it kind of left me with a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, feeling like I had something to prove. Even if it's just to myself, I can achieve my goals, I guess. That chapter kind of, it didn't necessarily close, but it kind of took a slight pivot where shortly after that, I ended up working for a local Birmingham startup. That is what kind of opened my doors to a lot more than just healthcare because of the people that I met and kind of the networking that I started doing, and how involved I became in the community. That I think that's at the point where I really learned the value of the connections that you make.
Mhm.
And I think that's what really opened my eyes to some of the things that maybe I can bring value in, and some of the things that I enjoy doing, and how those things align. So that's kind of what got me out of healthcare. And I pretty quickly, I started working in property management because of the people that I knew. I got an opportunity there, working, in buildings, whether it's managing a building, serving on the board of a building, of a condo building, being a leasing professional or a assistant property manager or a property manager. I realized that I enjoy the administrative, bureaucracy, the paperwork, following the procedure, and kind of the building the coalition to get like a capital project pushed forward and approved, or getting a new renovation done in the lobby of the building, or rolling out a new change to the way something's going to work, and getting the buy-in from the residents. I realized that I like doing that. I was serving on the board of a condo building, and we had to push through a parking deck renovation project of this old 50, 60-year-old parking deck, and it needed approval by the Birmingham Design Review Committee. And this committee meets at 7 in the morning, and they are in charge of making sure that, a big ugly building doesn't go up and ruin the character of a neighborhood. Okay. And so what that has to do with the parking deck is actually a lot more complicated, than I initially thought. And so, we had to go to the design review committee 3 times to get this thing approved, and we had to explain it to the residents and we had to redo the budget for that. And, we had to change the requirements and kind of the scope of work. And it involved going to the architect and the engineer and the contractor and then to the residents, back to the design review committee, back to the residents. And as tedious and onerous as that was, I really enjoyed it. So, the pivot to property management really helped me realize that I enjoy, infrastructure and planning. And it got me into doing, like the city planning process, and that sort of thing. And that got me involved with, started attending, local meetings, at the city, going to city hall to talking, when they have public hearings on things. I started realizing, what are these people doing? What are these people's jobs? How did they get here? And I was on a call where Birmingham recently changed, where there's no longer any minimum parking requirements to build a building. So you think maybe a mom and pop, they want to open, a small grocery store or something. Before, they had to have a set number of parking spaces, even if they didn't need it. They could have been in a walkable area. There's a bus stop in front of them. People are riding around on their scooters. They still had to build this massive sprawling parking lot that kind of ruins the density and charm of like a walkable area when you think of like Morris Avenue. And so I was on the call and I was like, well, who's leading this call? Who's on this? That, what do they do for the city of Birmingham? What is their degree? And I realized that some of these people, yeah, they're engineers and architects, but a lot of people in that field, in that space, have a Master of Public Administration. And guess who has a really impressive Master of Public Administration program? That's UAB. It's nationally recognized. They have an amazing mentoring program. So I realized, I need to go get my master's degree. And what do I need to do to go make that happen? Now I find myself in a place where I work for the School of Medicine. I work in administration. I assist, faculty and providers in the pediatric hematology oncology department, which is, kind of a full circle moment for me
Yeah.
because with pediatric oncology, I was that same little boy with cancer, so they're all doing incredible work. I enjoy it. When I talk to the parents and I'm scheduling, a call, an appointment for them, I can really empathize with what they're going through. They're being diligent in following up with our office, not because they don't trust that we didn't make the appointment. It's because, they really care and that's how they can show agency. And so, I do a lot of administration work for the wonderful faculty that I assist. But UAB has an amazing benefit where they will pay for graduate school if you are a full-time employee after 6 months. So I found myself where just yesterday I pressed submit on my application to the UAB Graduate School for their Master of Public Administration program. Fingers crossed. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm optimistic. I'm a proud UAB alumni, and Birmingham and UAB specifically has changed everything for me. It's opened doors for me, and just the nature of it being a smaller, metro area, it's very accessible from a young person's standpoint when it comes to networking and building a career. It's a great place to start a career. I never would have known that I would have ended up in property management, enjoying capital projects, and it's desperately needed.
That's Avery Heffernan, a UAB graduate in kinesiology and clinical exercise physiology. From rockets to recovery, his journey reminds us that resilience isn't learned in one moment, but built over time. Avery also has a great idea of what it means to be a Blazer.
I think resilience, when you think about the people who have to change their major, a number of times, or maybe the person, they have a small setback and they have to retake a class, but they really believe that they can be an awesome nurse, or they're double majoring, because they really think that they can bring a unique perspective to something. That's resilience. And then I think about myself. I'm really glad that I was resilient and didn't give up and go, oh, well, I'm never going to be able to do something that I like because I picked a super niche undergraduate degree. I kind of stuck with it. I think that that's a great example of resilience because I kept at it rather than just kind of, giving up and that sort of thing. So I think to be a blazer is to be resilient and to keep at it. There's a reason why people come from all over the world to go here. They see the Colot School of Business and they get inspired about what they can achieve. They see, the statistics from the School of Nursing and they're willing to be resilient and stay up late at night, to pass their clinicals. I think that's what it comes down to.